Hello, and my name's Tom Armbruster. I'm a great-grandson of a couple of missionaries to Hawaii, Dr. James William Smith and his wife, Millicent Knapp Smith. What we're going to do for 15 minutes or half hour this afternoon is talk about the tombstones that are here in the Smith-Waterhouse Cemetery. I'm standing by the tombstone of my great-great-grandfather, Dr. James William Smith, and there's his wife, Millicent Knapp Smith. He studied to be a physician, taking courses at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and doing an internship in New York. He got the idea when he saw a poster that said a physician is wanted in the Sandwich Islands, that he'd like to be a medical missionary to Hawaii. And so he had a childhood friend, Millicent Knapp, who lived a little ways away. James lived in Stamford, Connecticut, that little piece of Connecticut that sticks out to the southwest. And Millicent lived just a couple of villages away in Greenwich. Millicent had a brother, Horton Owen Knapp, who was already established as a missionary in what was then called the Sandwich Islands. He proposed to her. They remained engaged for a year, and then when it was time for them to sail, they got married. 12 days later, got on the boat and came to Hawaii. After a 6-week break-in period in Kailua on Oahu, they were assigned to Koloa, and it was in Koloa where he lived the rest of his life, from 1842 till his death in 1887. For most of that time, he was the only physician on this island, and he was responsible for the health of the native Hawaiians and others who came to him. At one point, when smallpox broke out, he took it on himself to vaccinate every person on the island of Kauai and also everyone on Ni'ihau. To vaccinate everyone on Ni'ihau, he had to go through a pretty intense storm, took his life in his hands, but got to Ni'ihau and vaccinated everyone and got back. So he saved thousands of lives on the island. Another of his accomplishments was during a cholera epidemic. He enforced a strict quarantine in the ports at Koloa and Nauwiliwili and kept cholera from invading the islands as well. In the early 1850s, when he was released from duty by the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, he continued his medical practice on his own, but also became an ordained minister and was a minister at the White Colonial Church, now called the Old Koloa Church. He had, in his early childhood, had inklings that he might want to become a minister, and now he fulfilled both goals by being a medical doctor and a working pastor. Let me, at this point, move down here to some other tombstones. One by one now, I'm going to take you through all of Dr. Smith's and Millicent Knapp Smith's many children and discuss their contributions to the Hawaiian Islands. This is Jared Knapp Smith, who went to medical school and came back to follow in his father's footsteps. He returned here in 1879, relieving Dr. Smith of the responsibility of being the only physician on the island, and he served here until 1897. In 1897, he was assassinated. He was shot to death on his porch, in the house that was right over there, just on the other side of Molino Road. He was shot to death one night by someone in whose girlfriends he'd diagnosed leprosy. It was a mother and daughter in whom he diagnosed leprosy. The mother's boyfriend encouraged his two sons to kill the doctor, thinking that if the doctor was killed, then the diagnosis would go away, and the mother and daughter wouldn't have to go to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. I'm going to read from a book that I wrote, Smith Papers, that has the letters and journals of Dr. and Mrs. Smith and many of their family members. These are some accounts of his assassination. I'm doing this to give something of a human face to these dead-looking tombstones. Here's a letter from another of Dr. Smith's children about his brother Jared's death. Immediately after the murder, natives and Portuguese began to arrive, and a crowd, very quiet and well behaved, and apparently from pure aloha, have been here all night and all day. One of the local newspapers, the Hawaiian Star, wrote a couple of days later about the funeral. Senator Henry Waterhouse says that the Koloa Church could not hold all the mourners. Hawaiians, Portuguese, and foreigners attended the services from all parts of the island. The Hawaiians felt the loss of Dr. Smith very keenly, as they regarded him as makua, or parent. The funeral was extremely sad and pathetic. Only Dr. Smith's most intimate friends are aware of what he has done for the Hawaiian race. To say that he has contributed all of his means and his time for their benefit would not be stating all. Since the founding of the Kauai Industrial School for Hawaiians, Dr. Smith has been obliged to mortgage his property and to devote his income to the support of that institution. He purchased band instruments, paid the expenses of tutors to teach the boys, supplied a printing press, and provided games for the use of the people whom he so dearly loved. Nobody appreciates what Dr. Smith has done for the Hawaiians more than do these people themselves. I might say, while I have this book out, that a more readable, really interesting book to read is one that was based on this, written and put together by others of my relatives, 100 Years of Healing. If you're in Koloa, you can find it at the soap shop in downtown Koloa. You can also buy it online. After Dr. Smith died, his work in education was taken up by his sister, Anna Juliet Smith, but she died 3 years later. Her husband, Joseph Kendall Farley, went on to encourage one of Jared's nephews, Dr. Alfred Herbert Waterhouse, to come to Koloa and pick up the medical practice, which was been vacant. He arrived in 1907. We'll talk more about him a little later. Now I'm going to step over to this row of tombstones. This one reads, "In memory of Mary Arabella, daughter of James W. and Millicent K. Smith, who died December 13th, 1848, aged 2 years and 16 days. This other one is another of their children who died young, in memory of Mary Eloisa, daughter of James W. Smith and Millicent K. Smith, who died April 12th, 1852, aged 1 year and 26 days. I look at this tombstone and I see, piece of stone and an old inscription, and I think, oh, how interesting, and oh, how sad. I want to make this more an issue of the heart and show that Dr. Smith and his wife were as affected as a mother and father would be affected today when a small child dies. I'm going to read from a letter that Millicent wrote. It actually took her 6 months to be able to get the feelings out and put them into words. It's a rather long letter. I'm just going to take out 2 pieces from it. In short sentences, I told her, this is her daughter, Mary Arabella was dying. In short sentences, I told her that the Savior loved her and was going to take her to himself before the conflict was over. I felt that it was a sacred place, that angels were hovering around, and that the Savior himself was near. My heart was comforted and strengthened when the conflict grew stronger and sharper. I could not but pray that the Spirit might soon be released, but I trust with submission to the divine will. It was the most bitter cup I have ever been called to drink, but I trust it has in some degree proved a blessing. Oh, how bad our hearts are that we should need such trials as these. About 6:30 in the morning, as the darkness of the night fled away, the spirit of our dear little one soared, we humbly trust, to the realms of endless day. With our own hands we closed her eyes and washed and dressed the once fair and lovely but now lifeless form, and laid her down for a last long sleep." There's a discussion of the funeral, and then she writes, "Then nothing remained but to proceed to a quarter of our yard." It still chokes me up a little when I read it, even though I've written this and read it many times. Then nothing remained but to proceed to a corner of our yard and there bury her from the sight of all that remained of one who was once so precious, so dear to our hearts. This is the corner of the yard, and this is where she was put over a century and a half ago. Our little infant, William Owen, was at the same time very ill with whooping cough, which was attended with an exhausting diarrhea. All now being over with our dear Arabella, our whole attention was directed to our sick baby. He was much emaciated, and we had many fears that he would soon follow his sister. As it turned out, though, William Owen, as we shall see, survived. Over to this tombstone, we have another of his children, Emma Clarissa Smith, named for Millicent's mother, Clarissa Hawley. Clary Hawley. She never married, worked throughout her life to assist first Jared and Juliet, and later her sister, so many names I get confused, Millicent Felina Smith-Waterhouse. And that is all of the tombstones of, that concludes all of the, one more. One more of Dr. Smith's children, Alfred Holly Smith, became a manager of Grove Farm, was assistant manager and then a full manager until 1903. Then he left, lived in Pomona, California, tried farming for a couple of years, and then came back and spent the rest of his life as the manager of the Lunalilo Home for Aged Hawaiians. And that finishes off all but one of the children of Dr. Smith who buried here. There are a couple more that I want to talk about who are not buried here. One is William Owen Smith. W.O. Smith became an attorney, went to Honolulu and practiced law. We like to tell the story in the family of how in Lahaina, if you've ever been to Lahaina and seen the enormous banyan tree that takes up a whole city block, the world's second largest banyan tree, W.O. Smith actually planted that tree on his father's birthday, July 8th, 1876. What we don't talk about so much is W.O. Smith's role with his sister's husband's brother, Henry Waterhouse, in the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. If you know a lot about Hawaiian history, you're familiar with the Bayonet Constitution, the Constitution of 1887 that challenged King Kalakaua. W.O. Smith and Henry Waterhouse were the authors of that Constitution, and then later on in 1893, they were part of the Committee of Public Safety that was formed on the evening of January 16th, 1893, and the next day overthrew Queen Liliuokalani. Later in his life, Queen Liliuokalani went to W.O. Smith when it was time to draw up her will, and with his help established the Queen Liliuokalani homes for children. Later, after she died, her will was challenged by some of her children, and W.O. Smith went into court to successfully defend the trust, and this is why we have those homes for children around the islands today. It's, as a mainland Haole, I think only in Hawaii can someone participate in the overthrow of a queen and then 10 or 20 years later be a participant in helping her establish a monument partially to herself and partially for the benefit of the Hawaiian people. Another of Dr. Smith's children was Lottie. Lottie for years wanted to marry George Wilcox, owner of the Grove Farm. He kept putting her off and putting her off and putting her off. Finally, she gave up on him and married Alfred Stedman Hartwell. Hartwell had come here in 1864 with a law degree. He'd responded to notice he saw that they needed a Supreme Court justice. He served as a Supreme Court justice up until the overthrow of the, off and on the Supreme Court, up until the overthrow of the Queen. He opposed the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. He told the conspirators at the Waterhouse house on Nu'uanu on January 16th, he said, don't overthrow the Queen. If you really you know, if you have to do it, put Ka'iulani on the throne, but don't take over the government yourselves. That's a mistake. His view didn't hold. But after the revolution and after Hawaii became a territory, he was back on the Supreme Court and eventually became Chief Justice of the Hawaiian Territorial Supreme Court. Another accomplishment of one of Dr. Smith's children. And checking my notes, we now come to the last child that I want to talk about, my great-grandmother, Millicent Felina Smith-Waterhouse, that we all called Lena. Lena grew up here and married my great-grandfather, William Waterhouse. William Waterhouse came to this island as a child when he had been expelled from Punahou. His dad, John Thomas Waterhouse, just wanted to get him off the island, get him out of Oahu, and sent him here to live with the Doles. The Doles, Daniel Dole had a school just mauka from the Smith house across the street. So they grew up together, Lena and William, also playing with Sanford Ballard Dole, Daniel Dole's son, someone else involved in the revolution, someone who we think, since it's common to assume that because Dole became the president of the provisional government and then later president of the republic and the first governor, we tend to think of him as someone who was behind the whole operation. But if you read Kuykendall's book, you see that actually Dole was recruited at the last minute, and Dole was one of those who said, no, don't overthrow the queen, put Ka'iulani on the throne if you want to, but you guys shouldn't take over the government. They talked him out of that position, and he did wind up leading the government the next day. William Waterhouse, when he got married, his father, wanting to get him out of the Hawaiian Islands, shipped him off to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. William had been out of the islands a couple of times to England. Lena had never left the islands. Can you imagine what a shock that was to be sent to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where she lived for 20 years and had 10 children? On one of his first nights in Cedar Rapids, he left a pitcher of water out on a table. He came in the next morning, this was winter, and the next morning the pitcher was shattered and there was a block of ice formed on the inside of the pitcher. It was so cold. Imagine what Lena went through having to make that adjustment, but she did. Once his father died, he sold the hotel that he'd been given to manage in Cedar Rapids, given by his father, and moved to Pasadena, where he became the third mayor of Pasadena. After he retired from working and investing, he came out here and spent the rest of his life here. These folks died in the early 1940s. They had, as I said, 10 children, 9 of whom grew to maturity. One of them was my grandmother, Edith Hazel Waterhouse Reed. But the first of those children, which is the one we're going to talk about next, is Dr. Alfred Herbert Waterhouse. So we're going to step across the row here. Dr. Waterhouse got his medical training. He went to Princeton and then Rush Medical College, did some work on Native American reservations in the Southwest. But then Joseph Kendall Farley wrote to him and said, Herbert, you ought to come out here to Koloa. We need you. We don't have a doctor. No one's picked up from Jared's work after he was murdered. Won't you come? And so he did. He and his wife, Mabel Palmer Waterhouse, came here, and he served as a physician in town from 1907 until his death in 1948. There are people living in this town who remember Dr. Waterhouse. They have to be at least 75 years old and have to have grown up here to remember him, but I know some people here, I've talked to them, who remember the work of Dr. Waterhouse. For example, when I was active as a computer programmer working at Pertec Computer Corporation, I was chatting with one of my programmer colleagues about Hawaii. I said I was going to Hawaii. He wanted to know where. He said he grew up on Kauai. I said, oh, I got relatives in Koloa. And he said, oh, I grew up in Koloa. And I said, yeah, well, these are the people who are there are descendants of my great uncle, Dr. Waterhouse. He gasped and said, you are related to Dr. Waterhouse? And from that moment, he treated me like God. I couldn't make a mistake. So high was his respect for Dr. Waterhouse. Another member of the Kaloa Union Church, Toyo, remembers Dr. Waterhouse very well, and you can find other people around the town as well. Dr. Waterhouse, to touch briefly on the other tombstones here, Dr. Waterhouse had three children. One of them was William Allen, who's, I'll just point over there. William Allen died young in a tragic fall from the 9th floor of a hotel balcony in Honolulu. Very sad. I never knew him. Another of his children was Marjorie Watts, who married Bob Watts Sr. Standing right behind the camera, Bob, will you come out here? Is Bob Watts Jr., my second cousin. It was Bob Watts, who we all called Uncle Bob, even though he was my first cousin once removed. My mom always called him Uncle Bob, even though they were cousins. It was Bob Watts who, after Dr. Waterhouse's death, really brought the family together and kept the whole tradition going in this town. As charitable as Dr. Waterhouse had been, giving away parcels of land to Japanese citizens in town, he didn't necessarily think about planning for his wife's and children's well-being after he died. It was Bob Watts who came in, figured out a plan to subdivide this land that had originally been mission land that had been inherited by the family. That's why we see this land subdivided now and built on, and was able to take care of Mabel. I knew Bob Watts really well, and fortunately, I got to know Marjorie May. My mom always liked her a lot, and I got to meet her on my first trip to Hawaii a couple of years before she passed away. And the third of her children, Florence Waterhouse Brandt, who we all called Kiki, another woman who inspired me to do good work working on the history of the family. Kiki was first married to Maitland Deese. Her children bear the last name of Deese. Then married George Wartz, who I know Peter Deese always looked up to, and then married Ike Brandt. I'm fortunate, like I knew Bob Watts and Marjorie May, to have known Kiki before she passed away. Kiki had three children. Peter, who was perhaps the most informed person about flora and fauna in the Hawaiian Islands, was a docent at a couple of the botanical gardens, served on the board of the mission and the museum and the historical society, just a fountain of information. He passed away recently. Another of the children is Theanne Deese, Theanne now Specht, who lives in Santa Clara, and Dulcie. The reason this area is in construction is that she lost her husband a few weeks ago. Another three great people who helped make my life better by knowing them. Okay, William Allen had six daughters, and five of them have arranged to have, none of them has passed away, but they have arranged in a pre-need fashion to have similar tombstones prepared here, not in chronological order. There's Priscilla, Pats isn't here yet. There's Bobby, who lives on the island, and Sue, Leona, who's Leona, and Neva. Bobby McCord's daughter, Lori Dill, is on the island now, and one of the stalwarts of the Kauai Historical Society, keeping our education, our knowledge of the island alive. Why don't we all stand together? Holly is one of Sue's daughters, and what did I leave out? What?
You did a great job, Tom.
You did a wonderful job.
Thank you, and a half hour or 20 minutes, whatever it is not sufficient to tell all of this. Anyone who really wants to know more about the family should read 100 Years of Healing. And then if you're of an academic bent and really want to get down in the details, often beautiful, sometimes ugly, but usually boring, read Smith papers. And what else could I say? I don't know.
You said it very well.
I said, okay, thank you.